Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Cult Musical Zone. Today, we have a very special guest today, and we're going to talk about the criminally underrated cult musical masterpiece, Bugsy Malone. So, I'm going to let my guest introduce himself and plug what he does.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Antonio. I am the host of the Cult Worthy Cinema podcast, as well as the Cult Worthy Classic, which is a podcast dedicated to cult worthy films made before 1970, and the co host of a podcast called The MILF and Me, which is a relationship podcast for people in their 40s who are trying to figure out the online dating world. And my co host and I just kind of go through Tinder profiles and love gurus on Instagram and TikTok and pretty much take the piss. And that's what I do. But my bread and butter, my heart and soul is cult film and especially cult musicals. And that's why I'm so happy to be on the show today to talk about, you're right, this underrated cult musical that just needs more recognition and needs more love for sure.
And that's what myself and my fabulous co host do. We celebrate all these really obscure cult musical classics. I mean, of course, you've got Rocky Horror and Shock Treatment, Best Little Whorehouse, and Phantom of Paradise, but I try to go very, very deep into the cult musical sort of Pandora's box, and I really seek out movies that have never been released on DVD or even VHS, and I put them
Mhm.
free on cultmusicals.com. Two films in particular, Highway of Heartache and Facelift, which are on for free to download on cultmusicals.com. But it's just cult movies. It's such a hard, interesting concept to grasp what makes a cult movie. And so that's what for cult musicals on Instagram, that's why I say cult, forgotten, obscure, underrated, and bizarre, because it's my hope and it's my passion project to introduce, to not only give highlights to, Bugsy Malone and other well-known cult musicals that we all love, Teen Witch, Little Shop, etc., but to also introduce new cult musicals to a new audience so that they can obtain a bigger cult musical following. Because every cult movie's got to start somewhere.
Agreed.
So, for instance, I'm really trying to push the Australian sci-fi rock cult musical called Sons of Steel, which is an underground cult musical that I'm really trying to get others to really to look at. It's almost like Jesus Christ Superstar meets Shock Treatment meets The Wall. Um,
Yes.
it's very anti-fascist. So,
And
yeah,
it's very
look,
hard to find.
actually, it's now on Blu-ray and DVD through not quite, I can't think of the name of the company, but it's an independent company. I have it on Blu-ray and I have it on VOD. You can actually rent it from YouTube. Um, and you can buy it from Google Play now, Sons of Steel. And there was comes with a soundtrack. I think the Blu-ray comes, the special edition comes with the soundtrack. I had the soundtrack already before, and it's kind of like grainy because it's ripped from the vinyl.
Mhm.
But you can get the soundtrack. I can't remember the name of the company, but if you just Google Sons of Steel Blu-ray, they
Yeah,
put it
I
in.
I looked for it last year because it's something I definitely wanted to do on the show. And here in the States, it was like 60 something dollars to bring in. I'm like, okay, it's definitely on the wish list, but I've got other things that are like pressing right now. But I think that's the other thing too, is like podcasts like yours and mine, getting people excited about obscure films and cult cinema that it's very easy to find some of the ones that I think were just buried for years, thanks to things like Tubi and Pluto TV and YouTube and stuff like that. But then there are the obscure ones. I say it with everything. You dip your toes in the waters of cult cinema and obscure cinema, and you want to keep finding more. And then you get like these Ark of the Covenant ones that you're like, I need to find this. I need to get this because
I
you're
have
so
my
used.
connections if
Yeah,
you
go
want.
ahead.
Sorry, I have my connections. So if there's something that has never been released on DVD or VHS, 99.9%, if it's a cult musical, I can find it. But it's sort of like on the podcast, my co-host, we always say cult musicals are incestuous. They're all interconnected, which we're going to talk about the connections between this one and the subsequent many, many other ones that we review. But they're all incestuous and interconnected.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Well, because Rocky Horror, Shock Treatment, Phantom, Best Little Whorehouse, they're all Little Shop. Everything has some Howard the Duck. They all
Mhm.
have Rockula. Teen Witch, they all have interconnections, even if it's like a composer, if it's a background singer, if it's an actor. Grease 2 and Xanadu has a huge connection. Howard the Duck and Grease 2 have a connection. So it's all, I don't want to say it's incestuous, but it's almost cosmic in my viewpoint that they're all interconnected. And I think with yours and this particular blog, it's just like that's always been my niche is weird musicals. I was never a Sound of Music fan. I was never a Grease fan. I actually found those musicals to be quite obnoxious. I
Mhm.
like the musicals that are edgy, that are forgotten. I was always a Shock Treatment fan way over Rocky Horror.
Me too. Yeah, I
Um,
think it's better.
yeah, that's controversial, but I agree. But I remember back in the day, it was almost impossible to find on DVD unless it was bootleg. And then it finally came on DVD, a bare bones DVD in 2006. And it's still not on Blu-ray in the States, but of course it's over here in the UK. You can get it on Blu-ray on Arrow Video.
Yep, I got it. I got the multi-region.
Yep.
I'm not gonna miss out on those opportunities.
And if you look on, I posted a link. If you look on the Instagram, in 2015, Shock Treatment came on stage here in the UK as a stage musical, and it played for 2 months at the King's Head Theatre. And I was lucky enough to see it. But I contacted the director, and he was like, "Somebody's going to leak it anyway. So here's the link, post it on YouTube, and you can watch it." There's lots of changes that they've made to Shock Treatment, but it took place in 2000. They transported it 2016, so pre-Trump, so they
Yeah.
sort of played on that. But so yeah, Bugsy Malone is one of those that still doesn't get the recognition it deserves, and that we can get into why. But before we get into why, what was your introduction to Bugsy Malone?
Okay, so I'm 42 years old. I was a latchkey kid in the 80s. So I, lucky enough, had parents that provided me with cable. So I'd come home, I'd have HBO, Cinemax, Disney Channel, and of course, all of the Turner channels like TNT, TBS, what have you. So it was not uncommon to find Bugsy Malone just playing randomly on a station back in those days. And it's interesting how, yeah, I liked it, but it wasn't something that I was going to go out of my way to see when I was younger. Maybe because at the time I didn't understand the irony of it. I didn't understand the artistic license that Alan Parker was taking with this film and the way it was cast. I just thought it was a movie for kids. And so for a good 20 years or so after seeing it as a kid, I just forgot about it. I just didn't think about it at all. It wasn't until I started doing my film blog and really diving into other Parker films that I'm like, oh, I have to go back and revisit this. And it just hit a whole other chord with me of now I'm looking at things with an appreciation of set design, of cinematography, of music, especially, because I was not a fan of Paul Williams' music when I was a kid, but give me Muppet Movie, Phantom of the Paradise, what have you. I'm like, oh, I love Paul Williams' music. And these songs that seemed kind of like silly and kitschy when I was a kid now have a whole new meaning and a whole new appreciation. And now this is a movie that I watch like maybe 2 or 3 times a year standard. And I've already covered it on my show, and I'll probably cover it again because I don't think I hit all the points I wanted to hit when I did it on my show. It'll probably have a follow up. So maybe we'll learn some new things today. I probably will from you because you really dig into these things about why this
Um,
film should be seen more.
I, my mind's always operated strange, so I have to know everything about everything. So this blog actually started in 2016 when I got my first master's. I was tasked to create something that had never been done in terms of a website. This is pre when I guess I don't know TikTok, etc. So I said my professor said create something that's a website that nobody's ever done before. And I was like, well, he's like, what is it that you love? And of course, I love Dolly Parton. She's my favorite person. I'm actually getting my PhD on Dolly Parton in the UK. But I was like, my favorite niche is cult musicals, like musicals. And then I try to take it a step further and do. So I promise you, there is method to this madness. I tasked myself to look back at all of those cult musicals that I love and explore new ones, watch them, rate them, and share them because it really takes fans to keep movies alive. Because with the internet, it's great, but there's some movie musicals that have not been rediscovered that have never been released. For instance,
Mhm.
Facelift has only aired once in the UK, and that was it. But it has a huge underground cult following where they make comic books, they make novellas, they make novels. And so I'm trying to push that. I keep trying to push Facelift, etc. So I remember I wrote about on my blog about 300 weird, obscure cult movie musicals. And one of the first ones that popped into my head was Bugsy Malone. And I remember distinctly, we're of the same age almost. I'm 33. I don't know if you remember back when Paramount started releasing VHSs of classics movies, Flipper, etc. And they had an intro set to These Days Are Ours. And it had different movies that were Paramount that were going to be released on VHS, and it showed Bugsy Malone on there. And I thought that was so interesting. But at the time, that was, even though they released it on VHS in the States, it was still hard to find because it never had a market. It still doesn't have a market in the United States, unless we're talking to, cult aficionados like ourselves. I don't know if you're aware. I mean, it took me moving to the UK to really understand it. Bugsy Malone was and is massively successful in the UK.
It is 100%.
So every person that I've talked to here as a friend has performed Bugsy Malone in school because it's, in America we do, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a play, Grease. You know how every high school has done Grease. It's
Yeah,
the opposite over here where primary schools, etc., do Bugsy Malone. And it's just part of the cultural fabric here of how big Bugsy Malone is. And so I was able to find it on Blu-ray here in 2017, pre it being on, available in the US. And so to me, it was obscure and cult and forgotten, but it's such a weird dynamic and a weird juxtaposition to how it's so part of the cultural phenomenon here in the UK. Everybody I've talked to has seen Bugsy Malone, or they've done Bugsy Malone, or they're my personal trainer over here. I told him about this today. He's like, "Oh, we performed the song from Bugsy Malone in primary school. We could have been anything." So it's so weird how certain cultures or certain subcultures or certain countries embrace something that the country that it originated in forgot. Because for all intents and purposes, it was an American film.
yeah, and I have an interesting theory about this. I've talked about it many times on my show. Is the whole dynamic of film, especially in the States compared to other countries, especially when you look at the old USSR films, we have like this obsession with box office here in the States, right? Where I think a film's take and a film's box office opening weekend performance gets spoken about more than it does the actual quality and cultural relevance of the film. And then people will completely forget about it until it's Oscar season. And then, oh, yeah, that movie's great. It's fantastic. We are really flimsy on our appreciation of film as a society because we look at everything as a dollar sign. And it's funny because like there's people who want films to fail. For example, Barbie. There were so many people here in the States that wanted Barbie to fail because of what it represented and because it was a female filmmaker. That's a whole other conversation I really don't want to get into on this podcast. But it's like the number one movie of the year. It's the number one movie for Warner Brothers. It's the number one movie directed by a female director. Had it not hit any of those strides, it would be a cult classic in 10, 15 years. That's what they were saying. With Bugsy not being a huge box office success in the States, I think that's one of the reasons why theaters pull it so quickly or it doesn't get released in as many theaters at one time. And when you don't have it available in home media for a decade, because we didn't have VHS as a widely available medium for people until the mid 80s, it is easy for films like that to get lost and forgotten. But I feel that in the UK and other European countries, the film itself and the presentation, the spectacle is appreciated more than the box office. So you could call it a capitalism thing, you could call it a consumerism thing. I've seen enough examples of that to really kind of show why films like this aren't as appreciated as much here in the States as they are over there. And when like back to the USSR films, I mean, a lot of those were subsidized by the government. They didn't have to go chasing studio money. They didn't have to go chasing independent film financiers or ask their parents for money to make these movies. like the government funded great artistic films, and that's why some of the great Soviet films exist, is because the government funded them. So it's easy for people in the States to kind of like put a blanket of how the films are appreciated worldwide. But unless you talk to people like yourself who live in other countries, or people who are, literally looking at the States going, why are you guys hating on these movies? These movies are great. A lot of people just don't get it.
Well, I think I can't speak for every film and why, or every cult musical, why it does better than others. But I think the reason Bugsy Malone did so well over here is because it was a British director, but also
Right.
movies like Bugsy Malone, even though it was a great original premise with children playing gangsters, it was a dime a dozen in terms of what was happening in terms of film.
Mm-hmm.
But over here, it represented something that had never really happened in the UK. So it represented Americana. So that's why country music's slowly becoming a big thing in the UK now. They have
Mm.
country singers because it's so foreign and so opposite to what they're used to. So that's my a reason that I think Bugsy Malone did so well over here, because it it's the same reason that the Crying Game flopped in the UK and was very controversial, but in the USA it was extremely
We loved
big.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, Boy George had a #1 hit from it, The Crying Game, and won all these Oscars because we were unaware of the the really real reality of Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, the UK, the all of that. So that's why it did so well in the USA, because we didn't know about it, nor do we care. And I think the reason Bugsy Malone did so well in the UK is because it represented something that had never happened here, but it was so American and so original. I mean, it's almost from when I've done, talk to people, field research, I guess, British people, I think they view Bugsy Malone the way that Americans have such a nostalgic view of Gone with the Wind or Wizard of Oz. It's on the same lines of that, of how big of a cultural movement and moment it is over here. Everybody, every school does it. It's been in the West End with adults. It's been in the West End quite a few times. I think it was actually playing last year or early this year. So it's never left the public consciousness in the UK. Hopefully with this blog and your blog and the rise of streaming, it can get more recognition, but sometimes you just don't know what recipes are. You don't know what makes something successful, but you also don't know what makes something unsuccessful. Some cult musicals that I love probably will never build up a huge following, and that's okay. That's okay. The Apple, um, like I said, Sons of Steel, Facelift, Highway of Heartache, those cult musicals may not ever build a massive cult following. Bugsy Malone may never, because I wouldn't consider Bugsy Malone a cult movie over here because of how
You're right.
normal it is. But I think in the States, it would be some underground cult musical. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The other thing that it's got going for it too is just the star power it has with its two leads.
Yes.
It's hard to not mention the film when you're talking about their particular catalogs, their particular resumes. To be in a film so young and have their whole careers ahead of them,
Great.
Jodie Foster especially. I mean, this was Taxi Driver season. She was already an Oscar nominee and already being talked about. And I think it's interesting that she is kind of like a secondary character, even though she's promoted as being like the main girl in the film, which she really kind of isn't. Um, it's one of those things where if it didn't have that star power, would it have as much relevance here in the States as it does now? I don't know. I think Alan Parker is a very respected director here in the States, but mostly for his other films. I mean, if you're a Pink
We'll get
Floyd
into it.
fan,
We'll get into
obviously,
that.
we'll get into that. But yeah, I think without the star power too, that's just another caveat to it that could be the make or break of whether or not this would be an even bigger cult hit if it didn't have those two people in it.
It's complex because, as we talk about on every episode, every a lot of cult musicals have their own fan base and even have their own names. And so, two of my good friends lead the Phantom of the Paradise screenings in Canada, Phantom
Hmm.
Palooza, and they have their own subsets and their own names. And the Rockula, they have Rocky Lights, which I interviewed the fan club president of the Rocky Lights. But with Bugsy, it's because I would venture to say that it's unknown. It's almost virtually unknown in the States. Um, it would be interesting to see if they start screening, but it's so complicated to try to get cult musicals screened. For instance, my favorite cult musical is The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and it just got a screening in Atlanta through I think this year, but it was so complicated for them to try to screen The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And this Best Little Whorehouse in Texas is yet to get a special edition Blu-ray. There is one now, but I think it's from Denmark. And you can get it and it comes with a poster and a lithograph. It's in English and I think it's region free. But you just can never predict. You can never predict if a cult musical, sometimes it's up to the fans to create merchandise. It's up to the fans to have screenings. It's up to the fans because um the companies, a lot of cult musicals, a lot of the companies that produce them folded. And
Yeah.
so a lot of the rights were up in limbo, like with Rockula and Teen Witch. But um with Bugsy coming from such a big, big, big company, it makes you wonder why it hasn't been afforded, screenings, etc., to sort of capitalize, especially on the Jodie Foster name and the Jodie Foster brand. But it'd be something I really be interested to talk to Paul Williams about because he's really nice. He follows our blog, but I'm too nervous to say something to him. I'm too nervous to. Of course, I am because I connect with him through Gloria and Dell who do Phantom Palooza. But it's just really interesting. I don't know. It's so complicated because, for instance, I'll use this another example. Best Little Whorehouse in Texas was actually the most successful movie musical of the 80s. And then after it got released on VHS, it sort of, dwindled. But, the gay community and other communities and country music lovers made that the cult film that it is. And they even had a night of 1,000 dollies on RuPaul's Drag Race, and one of them dressed like the Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. So it's, it really is up to fans to force companies and force theaters to play stuff. The Apple's just now getting screenings.
Yeah.
My friend, our co-host Helena, who lives in Portland, she says that she sees the Apple screening more than she sees Howard the Duck screening. And
Yeah.
I think, if you watch the last episode, I think Howard the Duck deserves more recognition than it gets, especially with the rise or decline of Marvel. That's another story to talk about. But so, yeah, I guess we got to the last part first about the legacy. It's just a shame of how it's not well known yet. But I think in time with streaming, like you said, Tubi, but also Amazon Video, etc., slowly people will start watching it and be like, oh, this is really, really cool and actually extremely original to have a gangster movie musical with children.
I agree. And here's the other thing too, which I talked about on the episode where I featured the film, and the people I brought on for it, they're just kind of naysayers to everything. So whenever I have those guests on for them, I had the same guests on for Rockula and for Phantom. It's me, defending the film to naysayers and trying to, change people's minds on it. And some minds can't be changed. But with Bugsy, what I think adds to the charm of it is that, yes, as much of a perfectionist as Alan Parker is in his filmmaking, I mean, the set design, the cinematography, everything is just so pitch perfect and well designed. Yet it's okay for the performances of the children, the choreography, the lip syncing, let's say all the performative aspects to be a little rudimentary. I think that's what adds to the charm of the film because you are seeing all of the master strokes of cinema on the screen. And then when it comes to the performances, it's like when you go and see a Christmas pageant or a school pageant and all the kids are doing their best and it's the effort that's adorable and entertaining, even though the actual level of performance is questionable. I feel that's what makes the movie so charming. The kids aren't 100% in step with the choreography. The kids aren't 100% in step with the lip syncing. There are lots of kids who are looking at the camera and breaking the fourth wall, but you don't mind it if you understand what they're actually trying to do with this film. And, I know pageants and things are big out there in the UK, I can understand how that would be so exciting for a UK film experience to see it as an audience because they're going in with that. We have so much pretentiousness out here in the States of movies where, I mean, I've heard of people walking out of this. I've tried to show this to so many people and they're like, I can't handle it. I can't handle it. I'm like, okay, well, then this wasn't meant for you. It'll find its audience. And that's kind of like what you and I are doing. I'm
Go
sorry. Do you
ahead.
mind if I ask you a question? Are you a fan of like live musical theater? Are you a fan of
Oh yeah.
actual musical theater? See, and that's one of the interesting things for me is I'm not. I do not enjoy theatrical experiences of musicals, mostly because I don't like waiting. I don't like waiting for scene changes. I don't like waiting for the entr'acte. I don't like the intermissions. I am very like valuable of my time and experience, but I love a cinematic musical. I agree with you. I'm not a huge fan of Sound of Music or Grease, but I love how when you do a cinematic version of a musical, you can skip all those little pieces of theater that some people love. Personally, I don't. I love that you can go through the scene changes. You can fade, dissolve, cut to, you can make that experience a 90-minute experience instead of like a 3-hour experience. And so it's interesting to me that I love the musical movies so much, especially cult ones, but I'm not a huge fan of the theatrical experience. And I don't know many people who feel the same way.
I am not a musical theater fan. I'm very particular about the musicals that I'll see, and I do not care. I am very particular about everything that I do. I don't care if somebody tries to sell me something. I am only going to see what I want to see. I see really dark or really obscure stage musicals. Like my favorite musical of all time was a musical called Taboo, which is Boy George's musical. And it did really well in the UK, didn't do well in the USA, came back to the UK and I was able to see it. And it's going to be resurrected. Bat Out of Hell, the Bat Out of Hell musical. I saw the Bat Out of Hell musical a few times. My favorite musical, stage musical, is Jesus Christ Superstar. But I'm not like a theater aficionado. I'm very particular about the musicals that I'll go see. But with I think with these particular cult musicals, I've always saw the beauty and I always saw the merit in them. And sometimes, you know, when you see something that nobody else has seen, and you really love it, you feel like you want to do a service to the cult musical and tell people you've got to see this movie. Oh my gosh, it's Meet the Feebles. You've got to see Highway of Heartache, the first nudie musical. You've got to see these really obscure, and then you realize that, you know, a lot of people come into it like, oh, I've discovered this movie, but it's not because I mean, a lot of these cult musicals have their own established underground fan bases. And, you know, you can't go into it expecting, I'm going to push this movie. You got to do research. Like, oh, let me contact this fan club. And, you know, with Sons of Steel, you know, there's a comic book series online for it. There's an underground cult for it. Um, you know, with Rockula, that's just now becoming a thing because of Tubi and etc. But it has an established fan base online, which if you want everyone, I was able to get a copy from Shannon, who runs the Rockulites. The unreleased soundtrack is you can download it for free on cultmusicals.com. But that's another thing that never got a soundtrack. So I think it's up to cult musical fans and cult fans in general, because your niche is you probably know films that aren't musicals. My niche is just cult musicals. I'm not a big into cult movies, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
you know movies that I would never know that you could introduce me or others to, vice versa. So
Yeah.
I just think with this movie, maybe it's where it needs to be in terms of over here in the UK, it's massive. In the USA, it's not so big. But maybe it's where it needs to be.
I think too, like I feel some of the studios, Paramount especially, Warner Brothers is kind of getting away from it. They're like, you know, doing weird things with their archive series of physical media. But Paramount's been releasing a lot of great films on Blu-ray with a lot of great features. So like the US Paramount Blu-ray of Bugsy, which I have on my shelf right now, it's a fantastic love letter to the film. It's got a great slipcover. It's got great features. If it is the last physical media release of that movie, I'm glad I have it. I'm glad that they gave time and attention to it because I think Paramount knows that there's fans out there of these movies. Even their streaming service here in the States has got a lot of deep cuts that really surprise me. So maybe it just has a lot to do with the studio that owns the rights and a lot to do with the studio that's got the property and the licensing. and how much they actually care about the fans. Because I mean, if you look at it fiscally, I don't think they're counting on breaking the bank with a lot of these boutique Blu-rays they're putting out there. So you have to understand that really that is for the fans. And they know that the true fans are going to get those while they're still available. And they'll probably live a second or third afterlife as, people start selling off their collections or trading, or there's all these communities now for physical media. I think Bugsy Malone is fortunate to have the love that it did get in its physical media release, which is, like you said, a lot better than some other cult musicals can say or claim.
Yeah, I mean, good thing on Warner. I do agree with Warner. They released Mame on Blu-ray with Lucy, which I
Mm-hmm.
love. Mame. That's another musical that's still critically torn apart, and people are like, I hate that movie. But I'm like, have you ever seen Lucy? It's kind of like Howard the Duck. If you tell people, have you actually seen Howard the Duck? Oh no, it's terrible. But have you actually seen it? No. Same thing with with Mame and Lucy and Mame. People are like, oh, that's the worst. I'm like, have you actually seen it? Have you actually seen how endearing Lucy is in it? And some people's minds can't be changed, but that's okay. They don't deserve to be your friends. They don't deserve to be your cult. They don't deserve to be in your cult.
Right.
But with this particular film, what we'll get into next is the music. That's the most important part to this entire thing for me, and in every cult musical. And you have an established songwriter, Paul Williams, the Carpenters, etc. But not only that, I mean, everyone in America knows who Paul Williams is. He's such a critically lauded songwriter. But the cult musical connection, of course, with the Muppet movie and Phantom of the Paradise. So for him to have that trilogy or that trinity of Muppet movie, Bugsy Malone, and Phantom of the Paradise, which all came out around the same time. I mean, he's a genius. Just imagine how much creativity he was having right now.
Yeah.
At that particular moment. The music in this movie is great. And I've introduced it to my niece and my cousin, and they love it. And this is 2017, and they love it. And of course, every time I'm with my niece, I have to put on My Name is Tallulah because I adore that song. And I think the music is so great. And some American reviewers, some, really liked it, but some thought it was unusual to have children lip syncing to adult voices. But I think it works. I think it's conscious, and I think it's great and genius.
I agree. I think that it can be off putting for a first time viewer because, like, you see all these kids and they're not dubbed by adults in their speaking roles. And then they start singing, and, half the voices are Paul Williams. So if you are a Paul Williams fan, that's even like a double down on that, too. And I think that it was one of the things that I didn't get as a kid. I didn't get why they had adult singing voices. And it can be confusing, I'm sure, to some people. But it is, as I've gotten older and I'm more appreciative of uniquity in film, that is what really kind of sets it apart other kid musicals. I go back and I think about like the Disney films of the 70s that were musicals, right? When they were going through like these really weird moments of trying to figure out what Disney's live action plan was. And I just feel like a lot of the songs and a lot of the performances and the voices that would sing in those movies, Pete's Dragon especially, like Pete's Dragon was a film that I loved as a kid, and now I have a hard time watching it, the original, because it is kind of grating. But the fact that they're lip singing with adults in this one, you take away the grating children voice, but you get the cuteness and the adorable energy of the child performers in action and in dialogue. So again, it's just adding to the uniquity of the film. And like you said, the songs are so good. They sound like Paul Williams songs. It's a very on brand for him. And lyrically, they're fascinating too, right? Because they're very mature lyrics. They're very complicated and emotional lyrics to come out of children's mouths. It again kind of just adds that uniquity of it, of like, especially the Tallulah song, especially yeah, I get how some people might look at, the themes as problematic or whatever. I say just turn off that brain and just enjoy it for what it is, because, it was made in a time where mindsets were different, and I don't think people were trying to look at everything as an exploitive motive. But
No,
yeah,
not at all. Not at
not at
all. And I
all.
always tell people, especially when I teach university, I tell you cannot look at a piece of art through modern eyes. You
Agreed,
always have
100%.
to you have to separate it. And it's because of a cult. Bugsy Malone is an amazing masterpiece. You can't um like some cult musicals in the 80s or 70s might be a little bit nowadays, but people are, are too sensitive in my opinion. You have to look at a piece of art as a product of its generation, but also it was just different. It was just different. And I don't think it necessarily was intended for children. I think it was a family thing, but with lots of great masterpieces, even children's masterpieces. There's quotes, there's sort of like nods to things that only adults would get. I quote Bugsy Malone a lot. Like I say, I don't have a dime for a shoe shine. But it's great and it was so genius. And I don't think there was any ill will at all. I think it was done because if you think about it this way: if it wasn't with children and it wasn't so campy and kitschy, if it was with an adult cast, will we be even talking about it right now?
Nope. Nope. I did have an interesting opinion of it on my episode, though, because the guests I had, they really had an issue that it was children playing the roles. And I'm like, okay, so what if it was Muppets? What if Bugsy Malone was a Muppet movie and not children? Would you feel any different about it? It's still directed at children in the sense that, it's marketed with that idea. And they're like, actually, I would have probably preferred it as a Muppet movie more than I would have had it with children or adults. I'm like, so that kind of throws your point out of the water. It doesn't matter what, vessel Alan Parker was using. I think it works with kids because the intent was not to like be mature than it really is and try to
But
like
it
exploit these children.
also look at the cultural thing. British people have no issue with it whatsoever. Every
Agreed.
primary
Agreed.
every primary school and middle school over here puts on Bugsy Malone, even high school. So this whole like, oh, it's take a hike.
Take a hike.
Um, take a hike. I don't have time or energy for that. I think it's an amazing film. My niece adores it. My cousin adores it. I think it's so great, and I think it's so underrated. And it's so genius. It's so genius, and it's just an amazing film. And of course, you've got Jodie Foster and Scott Bayou, or
Bayo.
however, Bayo, etc. Charles in Charge, Happy Days, Joni Lives Chachi. But you have those two figures that went on. Scott didn't, of course, go to superstardom, but he was the hot ticket in the 80s. He was a teen
Yeah,
heartthrob in the 80s. Charles in Charge, I remember watching Charles in Charge when I grew up. And Jodie Foster, of course, she is one of our greatest living actresses. So I
agreed.
think it's getting recognition because of those two. Primarily Jodie Foster. Primarily Jodie Foster. And um that they've done interviews with like reunions on DVDs and say that it's not like some cult musicals actors and actresses who still shy away or it takes them a long time to come around to. Jodie and Scott have always embraced this film and they've
Mhm.
always gave this film credit for really I know this was Scott's first film, I believe. It wasn't Jodie's first film, but it was both of their segues into the consciousness of film and the American public and the UK public. But Jessica Harper, it took her quite a while to come around to shock treatment, but she finally embraced it alongside Phantom of the Paradise. And but the good thing about this cult musical, they've always embraced it, and there's really nothing is stopping it from being so big in the States. But it's okay because it's found its cult. It has a massive following. So would you rather this particular gem be forgotten in the USA and it be debated for, stupid purposes, or would you rather it be a huge cultural movement that's so beloved? I think it's at a good place that it is now.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And there's a lot more manufactured outrage here in the States than there is in the UK. People will find a reason to be upset about anything. And I think that is what kind of keeps some films, whether it's a cult musical or not, from growing further. There's always going to be someone that's going to have to like put their foot down and be like, I don't like this. I don't like what this represents. Let them, like you said, take a hike. That's a different story. I think this is just I'm going to call this my optimistic opinion, is that with all of these strikes going on, with the writer's strike and the SAG-AFTRA strikes, we've seen this before where we're going to go through a drought of entertainment that's new. It's the same thing that happened in the pandemic. I mean, how many podcasts and blogs appeared between 2020 and 2023 because people couldn't go to the movies, people couldn't go to concerts. They start going back into back catalogs and libraries of things on Tubi and YouTube and physical media, and they start getting obsessed with older properties and older films that at one time were called B movies or trash movies or midnight movies, and now they're highly relevant in the zeitgeist. It's my optimistic opinion that that's going to happen again with the strike. We're going to go through a drought of new commercial films, of new properties and new licenses, and people are going to have an opportunity to go back and look at the older stuff again. So maybe this is the right time for Bugsy or the other films that you talk about to start making at least the next step in their evolution of rediscovery.
One thing that Bugsy has going for it is a kick-ass studio behind it that takes and supports their movies. They don't shy away from it. You can listen to the episode. Look how much Disney has tried to bury Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Dick Tracy.
Right.
They still have buried Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is not available on Disney Plus. Dick Tracy is on a bare bones Blu-ray that you can barely find. So that's another. Think of Madonna's Celebration tour. This would be a perfect, ample opportunity to repackage. I mean, Madonna is going to have a huge reemergence in her career. That would be a perfect opportunity then for them to re-air that and put it as a spotlight. But they don't. They don't.
Yeah.
And so it's a good, and now of course Fox, which owned Shock Treatment, Rocky Horror Picture Show, is owned by Disney. So that's another story. But I don't know if you noticed this too, a lot of movies that studios don't feel comfortable with, they'll sort of sublease those movies to private sort of like Arrow Video.
Vinegar Syndrome
Vinegar Syndrome and Shout Factory. They'll sort of let those studios, like, of course, Phantom of the Paradise, the Blu-ray was released through Shout Factory, not through Disney. So I think there's hope for that yet. But I think Bugsy Malone is in a great place to be rediscovered by American audiences, because it doesn't even need to be rediscovered in the UK, because it's never left their minds or their hearts.
I was just talking to a guy a few episodes back on my show. We did an Elaine May tribute, and we were talking about Ishtar, how Ishtar is highly overlooked here. Paul Williams did the music for Rodgers and Clark and all the little jingles and stuff like that. And at the New Beverly, they did a Paul Williams triple feature. They did Bugsy Malone, they did Phantom, and they did Ishtar. And Paul Williams and Tarantino were in the audience, and they just sang songs the whole time. And it was a sold out show, 100%. Why wouldn't it be? There is an interest in the rescreening, like you were talking about. We just got to get more theaters to start embracing repertory, because there may not be a lot of money and everything is so fiscally driven here, but I think it just takes the right executive. It takes the right creative and fiscal mind to recognize what people actually want. Because I think, and I hope you're in agreement with me, the last decade, you're hearing a lot from film goers, from cable cutters and streaming people, that we feel like we don't have a say in what studios are giving us anymore. They're telling us, no, you want Marvel, you want this, you want DC comic book movies, you want all this stuff.
That is backfiring, and that's not my niche. That's not my thing. But I'm well read. I understand what's happening. I mean, look at the live action Little Mermaid reboot that just lost Disney over $100 million. People are tired of reboots. Live actions are tired of things. That's why you have like Portland, my friend Helena, who's on this podcast a lot. There's a theater that Portland, that city, plays Apple. Earth Girls Are Easy. Nashville's doing Grease 2. Atlanta's doing Best Little Whorehouse. It's really up to the fans, unfortunately/fortunately, to push theaters to do stuff. For instance, Shock Treatment, I think, last year in London aired. And then there's another cult musical, Billy the Kid and the Green Bay's Vampire, that I keep trying to push. It's on Tubi now. but it got screened last year with the Prince Charles Cinema in London that does a lot of obscure, like Ishtar, etc. Which Ishtar is not a bad movie. I'm
No,
tired of that. Showgirls is not a bad movie.
nope.
Howard the Duck is not a bad movie. So it's really up to fans. But you know what? That's when people start pirating and having screenings of movies for free or just charging donations because fans love something so much that they are sort of forcing studios, or they're doing it on their own, like Repo the Genetic Opera. I don't know. I know there's a few couple of our co-hosts are part of troops that perform Repo. I think it was really, really hard for them to do it. I don't even think you're allowed to screen Reefer Madness, the movie musical, yet because it's owned by
Mm-mm.
Showtime. So they can only screen Tell Your Children, the 1936 film of Reefer Madness. But it's unfortunate. But I doubt that Disney or other, big studios are really going to give a damn if somebody screams the best little whorehouse in Texas, which unfortunately is owned by Disney.
Well, and
Um,
that's the future is like Disney being the conglomerate that it is, it's going to absorb everything. There
but you
is a
know what?
glimmer of hope though, because there is
Is
talks
that
that
right?
Apple might buy Disney. And if there's one thing that, I mean, Apple is a mega corporation as well, but I feel Apple is a lot more in tune of giving people what they want than Disney is. Disney has like this weird idea that everything has to be under lock and key and they'll give it to you when they want. So who knows? Who knows what the future brings when it comes to how they're going to license these things?
I mean, there's other cult musicals that I'm just Rocky Horror is here to stay. But the thing about Rocky Horror, the reverse happened with Rocky Horror. Now it's so pushed that I think cult musical Rocky Horror fans are trying to take Rocky back from mainstream media, if that makes sense, because it became where it was such a you could go buy a Rocky Horror doll, etc. And that's not what it's meant for.
I love that
And
you have that opinion because I've made that opinion so many times that I've never done Rocky on my show and I'm not going to either because I am under the opinion that Rocky is not a cult musical anymore. It's too iconic. It's been marketed too much. It is now mainstream. So
but
it doesn't need my help. It can be recognized and appreciated for sure, but my show is presenting and rediscoveries and Rocky Horror is you
but
say cult musical.
I'll turn your comment around and say, so yes, but that's why a lot of Rocky fans are refusing to do things with Disney. They're doing it
Right.
themselves. They're making Rocky Horror screenings original. They have their own Rocky Horror cons, etc. They're taking the power back. They're embracing shock treatment. They're going beyond shock treatment and doing Phantom, etc. So, with that being said, what happens, of course, is that if something becomes big in terms of Rocky Horror, without the Rocky Horror Picture Show and without Phantom of the Paradise, there would
Right.
be no musicals. Phantom was first, then Rocky Horror.
Yeah.
But if you know that that happens, then isn't it better for? It's so complicated. Isn't it better for a cult musical to remain underground so big studios can't get their claws into it?
In a perfect world, yes. The problem is, like I said, is unlike other countries, many of these things are United States produced. The ones that are UK produced sometimes have financial backing from the States. And it just creates a complication where now we're dealing with commerce more than we are artistic license. And that's always going to be the thing that gets in the way. You need those studios to release your film. That might change. I mean, I think the greatest news I heard in this last week is that Taylor Swift releasing her concert film that she financed and she made the connections with the theaters herself. And that thing is going to just be an astronomical moneymaker. And there aren't going to be any studios that get that money. If that's going to be a business model that other people can follow in the future, then I think that solves a lot of the problem, don't you?
Yeah, but I prefer for little blogs to say you love Rocky Horror and Phantom and Shock Treatment. Now look at this. And that's
Yeah.
why usually when I have like cult musical of the day, I'm like, it's Shock Treatment meets Jesus Christ Superstar, etc. And I prefer that. I mean, one of my favorite movies is Rhinestone, which is still is out on D. Hey, that, believe it or not, ooh, I almost dropped my phone. I got excited about that. Believe
It's
it or
fun.
not, it's out of print on DVD in America, but the Blu-ray was released in Europe or whatever. That album actually, people laugh about it being such a bad musical. That album actually scored Dolly two number one hit songs. So in terms, and it's I have to do this because of my research, but like that film pulled Dolly Parton out of depression because she had such a great time with Sylvester Stallone. I mean, he's so over the top, and I would love for there to be a Blu-ray where that's Sly and Dolly talk about their experiences. And I
Yeah.
would love for there to be a Blu-ray where, well, Bert's no longer with us, but where Dolly talks about her experience doing the best little whorehouse in Texas. So it's unfortunate, but I mean, it's just up to cult musical fans and cult movie fans to just own it and then sort of, but thank God for Arrow Video. Thank God for Shout Factory and Vinegar Syndrome. I think I just can't remember the name of the company that released Sons of Steel. It's up to us, it's up to those great sort of home media platforms to sort of resurrect DVDs, resurrect these movies that their own studios refuse to. I mean, why don't we have a now that Disney owns Best Little Whorehouse and owns Rhinestone, why don't we have Arrow or Shout Factory? But they probably tried with a lot of movies, but it's so hard for them to get the rights.
It's so hard for them to get the rights, and there are a lot of issues too with, let's say if there were songs that were licensed for use in the film but not actually part of the film itself, now you're dealing with two different licensing issues. You're dealing with the film licensing and you're dealing with the music licensing. And some of these, boutique labels, they just don't have the money or the resources to go chasing after these things. So I get it. Uh, it's just like I said, commerce kind of screws us over again in getting like better versions and respectable versions of these films. Like I said,
Yeah,
we got lucky with Bugsy. Bugsy does have good versions out there, and that's the whole point of this episode.
yeah, and it's got a great studio backing it up, which is really, 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 really important. You know, there's lots of Rocky Horror conventions where they're doing a little bit of reefer stuff, and well, probably more the ways than one. They're doing Reefer Madness and Phantom, but it will take time. It'll take time, and with this particular musical, it's just so good and it deserves recognition. I always joke and I always like to say that Bugsy Malone, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Dick Tracy all exist within the same universe.
I like that. I like that a lot. I've
I
never had anyone say that before, but it definitely works for me.
mean, because it's very noir, very much like Streets of Fire, which needs more recognition. I don't know if you've ever seen
Mhm.
Streets of Fire with,
Oh, of course.
yeah,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
Jim
it's
Steinman
classic.
and Jim Steinman and Stevie Nicks did the music, and it still deserves. Was it? I think a Shout Factory did the Blu-ray for that too.
Yeah, mine is Shout Factory. I have that one for sure.
So we've talked a lot about this movie because I'm very passionate about it, but the last part is that what would you, I think we've touched upon it, but what would you hope if you could control the narrative and the legacy? What would you hope the legacy of this cult musical would be?
It's funny because I am really big on like the filmmakers, right? Actors, I'm a big fan of the performance of the art of the craft, and they're also different and they all bring different energies. And when you do your research, you find out like, maybe they were the third or fourth pick because the first pick turned it down or whatever. Especially now when we can go back and see all like the audition tapes and screen tests and stuff like that of different people, it's crazy. But I never get away from the fact that like the filmmaker had a vision. And Alan Parker, when you see like the dark films that he made later on in the 80s and the 90s, to think that he started with this whimsical little musical that shows so much love and attention to detail and attention to fun. Like it's fun. This is a guy having fun. He wants the fun to emit from the screen. My personal idea with the legacy is if you love the film first, like you said, the film's always going to be there. But what's the next journey? Well, it's not going to be Jodie Foster and Scott Baio because all of their projects after this are very different than what this is. Jodie Foster's legacy lives on, Scott Baio's. But Alan Parker, I think, to me, the legacy is finding that filmmaker and following their path of where they went after this. Okay, so his films progressively got darker and darker and darker, but the DNA is always there. One of the things that I was talking about on my episode on this is the scene where Bugsy is recruiting the hobos, right? To go and get Dandy Dan and get the splurge guns. When he's singing the song and they're all marching in step around that room and it kind of looks like a factory setting, if you go and you watch The Wall, you see a lot of similar DNA in how it's framed, in the rhythmic motions of the actors and the action and the choreography to the music. And you think about the We Don't Need No Education and the students stomping around. It's very similar. So for me, the legacy is explore the filmmaker's DNA in his earlier works like Bugsy and go and watch all of his other films and start connecting how that DNA all intertwines. To me, the legacy is that.
Well, yeah, that proves the point again that our whole idea on this blog is that every cult musical is incestuous because then you have fame. Mm-hmm. You've got fame and then you've got The Wall. And so he doesn't get the recognition in the cult musical community that he deserves because you had Bugsy, then Fame, which is a cult for its phenomenon, and then The Wall, which, funny enough, I don't think still gets the recognition it deserves.
In its age group, it does. And after that, I think a lot of people just forget about it.
People find it controversial, but I'm like, it's supposed to be controversial. You're missing the point of The Wall. And of course, in Fame, you've got the connection. One of the actresses in Fame is one of the Pink Ladies in Grease too. So you've got another cult musical connection. But I think you're right. I say that you look at it from a different angle than I look at it. As like, don't let this cult musical be the last that you discover. Let it be a domino effect where it's sort of you see this one, then you discover this one, you discover this connection, and I don't know any other Alan Parker works besides Fame, Bugsy, and The Wall. So I'm not quite sure what other non-musical films that.
So this will be interesting for you, my friend, because he went through a very dark period. He did Midnight Express, one of the darkest films ever made, Mississippi Burning. But then you can tell this guy loves music because he made a film in the early 90s called The Commitments about the Irish, rhythm and blues band. But then he also did the big screen version of Evita with Madonna and Antonio Banderas. So you can tell that the dude has a passion for music and musicals. Who knows if his career path was something he decided he wanted to go that dark, or if that's just what Hollywood was offering him. But in the end, he did bring a lot of music to the screen. And to think that it started with this, I think it's pretty exciting.
That's another well, Evita's not a cult musical, but the cult musical connection with Madonna being Breathless. Mm-hmm. And, as a Madonna fan, it's my interpretation that the reason that Dick Tracy and Evita doesn't get the love that deserves is because people still have a very big anti-Madonna sentiment, which is so bizarre to me. I lived through that in the 90s. I'm sure you lived through that before then. She was so controversial that people had such a huge anti-Madonna sentiment. But now I think it's an ageist thing that people are hating her on. But I don't want Madonna to be gone before we give her the recognition that she deserves for being such a kick-ass songwriter and a kick-ass actress. I'll digress at this. I'll leave it at this. But Andrew Weber, he was at a conference, right? And this snarky sort of interviewer brought up Evita the movie, and they're like, "So, Madonna," and the audience started just laughing. And he's like, "I remember with Tim Rice seeing the Material Girl music video, and he said, I don't know who that girl is, but that's Evita." And he said, nobody else could have played that role. He said, she is Evita. Mm-hmm. And that shut people up. Right. So, I don't know. Some people just don't get it. And you can't, like you said, you just can't make people get it. Like Rockula has an amazing soundtrack. So I don't know why people don't get Rockula yet.
Okay. So I love all the songs in Rockula, but the Rapula scene is a little much for me. That's a stretch.
What is that? Her name was Lena.
She wanted my Weena.
Yeah. And funny enough, Dean Cameron wrote some of the songs in that movie, and Thomas Dolby did, who She Blinded Me with Science, and he wrote the
Mhm.
songs for Howard the Duck. I digress, but I've never asked this before since you're brand new. If you had to think, and I know it's probably hard, I know you love Bugsy because you'd agreed to do this, but if you
Mhm.
had to name one cult musical that you could choose over every cult musical, and you would be the fan club aficionado, fan club president of that cult musical, what would it be?
A 100% shock treatment. Yeah,
Ah,
shock treatment has been my uh, cult musical heart and bread and butter since I saw it maybe at age 10. And I'm just meeting you for the first time. How I discovered shock treatment, I actually saw shock treatment before Rocky Horror because I was 10 years old in a blockbuster and they had put shock treatment in the horror section, not the musical section. And when you think about it, you've got the picture of Richard O'Brien in the all red on the cover of the VHS. It's just his face. It looks very horror ish. And I was trying to rent Shocker, the Wes Craven film about a guy who gets electrocuted and then his spirit goes into like the electrical mainframe. And it was out. So I grabbed the next video next to it, which was Shock Treatment. Watching that at 10 years old and not knowing anything about Rocky Horror Picture Show other than the name, it just instantly stuck with me because I loved Jessica Harper. I loved Cliff DeYoung. And eventually, like a year or two later, Drop Dead Fred comes out. So you got Rick Mayall. I'm like, okay, I love this movie and it's stuck with me ever since. And I'm one of those guys that I defend to this day. I'm like, shock treatment is better than Rocky Horror. Rocky Horror is more iconic. And let's put it this way, the songs in Rocky Horror are more seductive to the pop music brain. Like most people will listen to Rocky Horror songs, find the beats that are very pop music friendly, and that's what kind of lures them in. Where shock treatment, you have to work a little bit harder to appreciate the songs. But once you do, you realize how amazingly they are orchestrated and performed and written and the depth and the brevity of them, especially when Jessica Harper sings them. Like Jessica Harper's voice in that and in Phantom, oh my God, like an angel. I'm just such a huge fan of that movie and those performances. And if they ever, I remember being in high school saying, I wish we could do shock horror as a stage production so I could play Farley Flavors and Brad. Like
I see that.
I used to just love singing those. I still sing them in the car. Like I listen to that soundtrack all the time. Like it's just in me. It's part of my DNA now.
Well, Rocky Horror fans have, of course, embraced shock treatment immensely, but it's almost impossible to imagine a time when Rocky Horror fans didn't embrace shock treatment. But it was about 10 years ago that a lot of Rocky Horror fans didn't know what shock treatment was, or they
Yep.
didn't like shock treatment. But now it's so beloved within the Rocky Horror community. And I think Rocky Horror is wonderful. We have to give it its flowers because it really was the queen of the cult musical. Phantom's the king. But Rocky Horror and Phantom are pretty straightforward. But with shock treatment, it requires years for you to really catch on to what Richard O'Brien was trying to say because we weren't living in that time yet. But
Mm-hmm.
now we live in a time that's scarier than shock treatment.
Right. The reality TV explosion, the manufactured drama that
Social
people are
media,
now addicted to. Yeah, it
Big
called it out
Brother.
back in 1980s.
Now we know about Big Brother and we know about surveillance and social
Mm-hmm.
media surveillance. I mean, that's what the musical, and I'll send it to you, the stage musical really played upon was that the time we live in now, right now is much more scary than shock treatment. Because Farley Flavors is no longer Brad's brother. He's like this presidential candidate, CEO, entrepreneur who wants to rule the world. And
I mean, yeah, it tracks for modern times.
yeah, so I appreciate it. And I appreciate you having this love because a lot of 99.9% of the cult musical fans that I messaged about this, they had never seen Bugsy Malone.
I think you just have to go after the older ones like me, like the ones that were actually alive when it was on TV on regular rotation. Because I really think that once we got away from traditional cable and got into, let's say direct video or in TiVo and stuff like that, where you had more options of what you wanted to watch. I honestly think that exposure to things like this decreased because back in the day, you had your TV guide or you channel surfed, and that's how you found things. And I think the generations who have come up past that time have become very selective in what they want to see and not
Yep.
what they were allowed to see. And I think that speaks highly of the age gap when it comes to appreciations of cult musicals.
Yeah, that's how Teen Witch became a sort of a cult
That's
musical.
how I saw it, was on TNT at 10 o'clock, whatever, when I was
Well,
a
and
kid.
then it was like HBO, then it was Fox Family, and then Disney Channel aired Teen Witch, and that's how it got its traction. So that's sort of with Bugsy, and that's how other, that's how other cult musicals sort of got their. But any cult movie really is how it got. I mean, Showgirls got a cult following because they played a butchered, edited version on TBS with the digital bras and the digital
Mm-hmm.
panties. And I mean, I don't know. This movie's great. I implore all cult musical fans to watch it. But if not, if they don't come around to it, at least it's highly beloved with certain groups and a huge culture. So I think Americans, this is particular to Americans, give Bugsy Malone a chance.
And I think the key to kind of getting people exposed is put a double feature with it. Put it with something that might have a lot more cultural relevance and then have this be the follow up, you know? So, like, if you want to watch an old gangster movie like The Untouchables, everyone loves The Untouchables with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery. Follow it up with Bugsy Malone. Great double feature. Doesn't seem like it on paper, but the themes play together and you're exposing a film to people who are already aware of something that's culturally relevant and introducing them to something that is a playful spin on that. Let's say prohibition. Let's say
Yeah.
gangster movies. That's what I try to do when I host double features for my cult film nights. Is you screen something that people have a familiarity with, and then follow it up with something that you want them to discover for the first time.
You could do it two ways, and then we'll leave it at this. You could do it the light way by having the Paul Williams night. You could screen it with the Muppet movie,
Mm-hmm.
or you could screen it with Phantom, or if you want to do it with The Wall, you could screen this with The Wall.
You could, 100%.
I would probably, in order to get to segue into the consciousness of Americans, I would probably do a double feature with the Muppet movie.
Yeah,
I think that would work.
I agree. That's a great double feature. I want to watch it right now.
All right. Do you have anything else to say? What's your favorite line from the movie? And then we will close this.
My whole favorite line and scene is the whole thing when they're down the line and they're passing it to Dexter Fletcher's character. What's his name? I forget.
Something.
Hold on. I have it right here. Babyface. He's like, hey, tell Babyface. Hey, tell Babyface. Hey, tell Babyface. And Dexter Fletcher is the very last kid in the row. He's like, okay, wait, I'm Babyface. I love that part. It's great.
I love Fat Sam's. I love his quotes. Like, I ain't got a dime for a shoe shine. But I also love Jodie Foster because you can tell that they emulated her role after Mae West. The whole,
Yeah.
the way that she acts. And she was brilliant. I mean, if you watch My Name is Tallulah, the way that she looks and when she goes into the audience and just her expressions, this movie is genius. But I appreciate you so much. And hopefully this won't be your last time on
Oh,
this.
no.
And
Have me back anytime.
the next ones we're going to do are Labyrinth and then a double feature of Purple Rain and the infamous sequel, Graffiti Bridge. And then a Michael Jackson double feature with Captain EO and Moonwalker, which would be really interesting to see if you would ever like to talk about those two.
Well, I mean, I saw Captain EO multiple times at Disneyland growing up because I'm of that age. And actually, just a second.
Ah! Oh my God, it's cosmic.
That is OG. That's 1988, 89 Disneyland. I got it at the Captain EO gift shop and it stays with me. It lives with me forever.
Sometimes people don't get it, but sometimes I'll go, Hooter! Because I'm like, I don't know what MJ's problem with Hooter was. He kept blaming Hooter for everything.
For everything.
Thank you so much. You're so kick-ass. And please
Thank
don't be
you.
a stranger I will message you soon.
Absolutely. And I hope to have you on my show so, we can
Yes.
have more conversations about other cult musicals. I've still got a laundry list of ones that I want to go through. So, again, thank you for having me as your guest. I had a blast, and everyone go watch Bugsy Malone and just start taking that cult musical journey. It's worth it.